In 1961, deep under the Arctic Ocean, a Soviet submarine's reactor began to melt down. What happened next was so horrifying. The Soviet Union kept it secret for decades. This is the untold story of K-19, the submarine they called the Widowmaker. It was July 4, 1961. Far beneath the dark waters of the North Atlantic, a giant shadow moved silently through the depths. A Soviet nuclear submarine, the pride of the Red Fleet. Her name was K-19. She was built to be unstoppable, a symbol of Soviet power at the height of the Cold War. But no one aboard knew that within hours, this mighty machine would turn into a floating nuclear nightmare. The men on board were young, proud and full of belief in their mission. They had trained for years to serve their country and to prove that the Soviet Navy was equal to, or even stronger than, the Americans. The submarine was new, powerful and armed with nuclear torpedoes capable of destroying entire cities. As K-19 cut through the freezing Atlantic, Captain Nikolai Zateyev stood on the bridge, his eyes focused on the endless ocean ahead. He was a strict but fair officer, respected and feared by his men. For him, discipline was everything. He had seen enough of war and politics to know that mistakes in a submarine could cost not just lives, but the future of the nation. But deep inside the steel hull of the submarine, something was already wrong. The K-19 had been rushed into service. Soviet leaders wanted to show the world they could build and deploy nuclear submarines faster than the Americans. The shipyard in Severodvinsk worked day and night, welding, bolting, and assembling the submarine under brutal pressure from Moscow. Deadlines mattered more than safety. There were warnings, missing safety valves, weak joints, and even poor welding. But nobody dared to delay the project. By the time the K-19 was launched, many of her builders secretly feared she was cursed. During construction, several workers had died in accidents. Even the crew joked nervously that K stood for Kuroshka, the cursed one. But once she sailed, pride replaced fear. The crew believed in her, and when they were chosen for a top-secret mission, a deep-sea test of the missile system, they accepted it with honor. The morning of the mission was calm. The crew followed routine checks and laughter echoed in the corridors. The engine rooms hummed with the low growl of power. In the torpedo room, young sailors polished the steel tubes that held nuclear weapons. The reactor team in the rear compartment monitored the pressure and temperature readings. Everything seemed normal. But then, just after noon, one of the reactor engineers noticed something unusual. The cooling system pressure was dropping. The temperature was climbing, slowly but steadily. He reported it to the control room. Captain Zateyev frowned. "Check the backup pumps," he ordered. Within minutes, engineers discovered the unthinkable. The entire cooling system had failed. A critical pipeline had burst. The reactor core, the heart of the submarine, was overheating. Without cooling water, the temperature inside the uranium rods would rise uncontrollably. The result would not just be an explosion, but a full nuclear meltdown, a catastrophe that could release deadly radiation and kill everyone on board. The captain's face turned pale. There was no radio contact with Moscow. The submarine's communication antenna had broken days earlier. They were completely alone, hundreds of feet under the ocean. He gathered his officers in the control room. The air was tense. "We cannot surface immediately," said one officer. "The Americans might detect us." Another argued, "If the core melts, we'll be dead before they ever find us." Captain Zateyev looked at his crew, young men in their 20s, some barely old enough to drink. He knew he had to decide fast. "Surface the boat," he said finally. "Bring her up." The K-19 slowly rose toward the light. The hull creaked under pressure, the sound echoing like thunder in the narrow corridors. When they broke through the surface, cold wind and waves crashed over the deck. The men climbed up to check for any damage, but the true danger was below. Inside the reactor compartment, steam hissed violently. The thermometer was climbing past safe limits. The radiation alarms began to ring. The crew covered their faces with makeshift masks, cotton cloths soaked in alcohol, but they knew it would not help. Chief Engineer Boris Korchalov took charge of the reactor team. His voice was steady, but his eyes revealed the truth. They had no spare parts, no proper protective suits, and no time. The only way to prevent the reactor from exploding was to build a new cooling system by hand, using thin pipes and whatever materials they could find. It was a desperate plan, but there was no other choice. 8 young men volunteered. They crawled into the reactor chamber, a space filled with blinding heat and invisible radiation. Each man knew it was a death sentence. The temperature inside the compartment was more than 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Steam burned their skin instantly. The smell of metal and chemicals filled the air. Yet they worked without hesitation, tightening bolts, connecting hoses, and fighting to control the rising pressure. Minutes felt like hours. The radiation was so strong that their bodies began to weaken within minutes. One man vomited and collapsed but refused to leave. Another tied his sleeves to the pipe so he wouldn't fall over before finishing his task. When they finally succeeded in restoring a temporary flow of water into the reactor, they could barely move. The temperature began to drop, just a few degrees at first, then more. The reactor stabilized. The submarine was safe, but the men who had saved her were dying. When the volunteers returned to the living quarters, their faces were ghostly pale. Their hands were covered in burns. Some were shaking uncontrollably. They tried to smile, telling their comrades, "It's all right now." But everyone could see the truth. The radiation levels in their bodies were hundreds of times higher than the lethal limit. Captain Zatayev ordered immediate medical isolation, but there was no real medicine for radiation sickness. The submarine's small infirmary was filled with groans and whispers. The doctor tried to comfort them, giving morphine and water, but nothing helped. Their skin blistered and peeled. Their hair began to fall out, and within hours, some slipped into unconsciousness when, meanwhile, the captain faced another nightmare. The submarine's power was dropping. Without the reactor, the systems could not hold pressure or oxygen. Batteries were running low. The air inside grew hot, heavy, and full of moisture. The smell of metal and sweat filled the rooms. They sent out distress signals, hoping another Soviet ship might hear them. But there was silence. Finally, they spotted a ship on the horizon, a NATO vessel. The crew watched nervously through periscopes. If the Americans approached, they might discover the damaged submarine and the nuclear weapons aboard. That would create an international incident the Soviets could never admit. Captain Zatayev made a bold decision. He would not call for foreign help. He would rather die than let the enemy see Soviet secrets. He ordered his men to stay calm and continue repairs. The reactor was still unstable, but the improvised cooling system was holding. The captain knew the survivors in the reactor room would not last the night. He walked among his men, speaking quietly to each one. Some asked about their families. Others begged for water. Many simply lay still, staring at the ceiling. The youngest sailor, barely 19, whispered, "Captain, will we make it home?" Zatayev paused, unable to answer. Finally he said, "We'll make it. I promise you that." But deep down he wasn't sure. By evening the sea was calm again, but inside the K-19, death was everywhere. The volunteers who entered the reactor compartment had all collapsed. The ship's doctor was now sick himself. The radiation had spread through the ventilation system, touching every room. Captain Zatayev ordered the submarine to shut down all non-essential systems. The corridors fell silent. Only the hum of emergency lights and the sound of the waves outside remained. Then, through the static, a faint signal came in. A Soviet vessel was responding. Help was coming. The captain felt relief for the first time in hours, but he knew they still had to survive the night. The reactor could still overheat. The wounded could still die before dawn. The last 3 hours of the K-19's nightmare had begun. As the men prepared for the long, cold night, some prayed. Others wrote letters they would never send. They didn't know that their story would remain hidden for decades, buried by Soviet secrecy. For them, the only thing that mattered now was survival. The men of K-19 waited in silence, floating in the cold, dark sea. Every sound inside the submarine echoed. The ticking of pipes, the hiss of steam, the soft groan of metal. They had fought the impossible, and now all they could do was survive long enough to be found. The captain sat alone in the control room. His uniform was soaked in sweat and seawater. On the table before him lay a list, the names of the men who had entered the reactor room. 8 names, 8 heroes. None of them were expected to live until morning. He closed his eyes and whispered, "You saved us all." Outside, the waves were calm, and the stars reflected across the black water. But beneath that quiet surface, the K-19 was dying. The radiation had spread through every corridor, every wall, every breath. By midnight, the air filtration systems failed. The submarine's air grew heavy with carbon dioxide. The crew could barely breathe. The men used wet towels as makeshift masks, their hands trembling, their bodies weak. Some of the younger sailors began to hallucinate. They saw flashes of light, heard voices that weren't there. Radiation was burning their nerves from the inside. The doctor, his own skin blistered, moved slowly between them, whispering words of comfort. He had no medicine left, no bandages, no clean water, only words. At dawn, a faint echo of engines came from the distance. The watchman on deck lifted his binoculars with shaking hands. A shape appeared on the horizon, and a Soviet ship. "Captain, it's ours," he shouted. A wave of relief swept through the crew. They were no longer alone. Captain Zateyev ordered the emergency flares to be fired. Bright red lights burst into the sky, painting the sea with color. Within hours, a Soviet diesel submarine S-270 arrived. The rescue had begun, but even rescue came with danger. No one knew how much radiation the K-19 still carried. Approaching her too closely could mean death. The rescue commander hesitated, waiting for instructions from Moscow. The radio crackled with static and short, cold orders. "Rescue only if safe. Do not let the Americans see." The captain clenched his fists. His men were dying. And now bureaucracy threatened to finish what the radiation had started. He ordered the transfer to begin, and not immediately. The ASOR rescue teams climbed aboard K-19. They were met with silence and a smell they would never forget, a mix of burnt metal, chemicals, and death. The corridors were dark. Flashlights swept across narrow walls stained with soot and sweat. The rescuers found men lying where they had fallen, some still alive, some not. They carried them one by one through the hatches, careful not to touch the reactor section. Those who could still walk helped carry the others. One sailor, too weak to move, whispered, "Don't touch me. I'm radioactive." The rescuer ignored him and lifted him anyway. By the time the transfer was complete, more than half the crew was severely ill. Some could no longer open their eyes. Their skin had turned a deep red, their hair falling out in clumps. The moment they reached the rescue submarine, they were given oxygen and morphine. But the doctors knew the truth. It was already too late for many. Captain Zateyev was the last to leave K-19. He stood on the deck one final time, looking down at the submarine that had almost destroyed his crew. The sun was rising above the ocean, casting a faint golden glow across the waves. He whispered, "You did your duty." Then he climbed aboard the rescue vessel, and K-19 was left drifting, silent, damaged, and radioactive. Over the next few days, Soviet ships towed K-19 back toward home waters, but the suffering didn't end there. Inside the rescue submarine, the men who had been exposed to the reactor began to die one after another. Boris Korchilov, the chief engineer, lasted only 2 days. His skin had turned gray, his body swollen with burns that came from inside. Before he died, he said softly to his comrades, "Don't let anyone forget us." The others followed soon after. By the end of the week, all 8 volunteers were gone. When K-19 finally reached port, the surviving crew were taken straight to secret military hospitals. The Soviet government immediately sealed all reports and ordered silence. The families were told nothing. Officially, it was a training accident. The word radiation was never mentioned. Captain Zateyev faced questioning from senior officers. Some blamed him for surfacing too soon. Others accused him of risking national security by nearly exposing Soviet nuclear secrets to NATO. But there were also those who saw the truth, that he had saved his crew, his submarine, and possibly the entire Northern Fleet. Still, in the Soviet system, heroism was a dangerous thing. He was not given medals. He was given silence. The surviving crew were sent to different assignments. Some were discharged quietly, others reassigned far from home. Many suffered from radiation sickness for years. Their bodies aged faster than their faces. Their teeth fell out, their joints collapsed. And they carried the scars of invisible fire, but they never forgot. For decades, the story of K-19 was hidden from the world. It wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Union that the full truth came to light. When the archives opened, historians discovered the shocking details: the faulty construction, the ignored safety reports, the rushed deadlines. K-19 had been a ticking time bomb from the moment she left the shipyard. The submarine was later given a nickname among sailors, the Widowmaker, because every time she sailed, someone died. Even after repairs, she suffered other accidents, fires, and radiation leaks. By the time she was decommissioned in 1991, more than 20 officers and sailors had died in incidents connected to her. In 2002, decades after the disaster, the surviving crew gathered in Russia for a memorial. Many were old and frail, their hair white, their hands trembling. They stood together before a monument that finally bore their names. The men who had gone into the reactor room, knowing they would never return. Captain Zateyev had died years earlier, never fully recognized for what he did, but his men remembered. They spoke his name with respect, not fear. One of them said, "He saved the world from a second Hiroshima." And perhaps he did. Experts later calculated that if the reactor had exploded, it would have spread radiation across the North Atlantic, poisoning the sea and air, and possibly triggering an international conflict between the Soviet Union and NATO. The sacrifice of those 8 men may have prevented a global catastrophe. Yet, their story remained largely unknown, until now. Today, the rusted remains of K-19 lie dismantled in a naval yard, her radioactive parts buried, her name remembered by few. But for those who know her story, she is not just a submarine. She is a reminder of what happens when pride overtakes caution, of what courage truly means, and of the price paid by men who stood between the world and disaster.